Oh, what a mess.
Welcome to the Barbecue, where the cast and creators of Oops All Bards grill each other about the most recent episode. I am your host and game manager, Jillian Ashley Blair Ivy, although if you call me anything other than Jill, I'm assuming that I'm in trouble with the law. Joining me are our bards. Please introduce yourselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Banks and I play Belle Serdamiel.
I am Ross Curry. I play Andric Harrowhold.
I'm Bob Killian. I play Kelonian Stumps.
Hiya, I'm Anne Coleman, and I play Clarice Salazar.
Hi, I'm Tage Das, and I play Cretaceous Thunderthigh.
So we find ourselves back on the train in episode 7. This was another episode that we recorded with Ashley joining us remotely on Zoom with everybody else at the table, which always promotes some interesting challenges. Ashley, we had combat in this episode. How did it feel to be away from everybody else and still participating in combat?
Honestly, it was fine. Most of the combat was not involving Belle.
Yeah. Yeah, you encountered the mimic and you
Yeah,
noped out of
and
that
then we
situation.
said no, thank you. So,
Yes.
so it actually wasn't that bad. And I think the fact that the party was split kind of, this is gonna sound weird, but it made me feel a little better. Like there was stuff going on that I wasn't involved in, but also it was because I wasn't involved in it, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it was fine.
That makes sense. And you were out with Kilonian. Bob, how is it for you having everybody else at the table, but your scene partner being remote for that session?
In terms of the visuals, we're both sort of looking at the same like plot, the same like board to see like sort of where we are in this situation. So I kind of feel like we're pretty similar situation with that. Yeah, and just communicating back and forth. I mean, I don't recall there being any like issue with that. Ashley, you're a very lively person to improv with, so
Thank
so
you.
that's good. Yeah, so I thought it was fun, and I enjoyed doing like kind of a little pair off where we can go and do our thing, and people can something else is going on in another car. I think that was kind of fun.
Yeah. That was I think one of the things that being on this train kind of like, with the train, the physical space means that it actually is easier sometimes for everybody to split off. Speaking of folks getting split off, Ross, you as Andric took Higgins, who we now know if we've listened to the entirety of episode 7. And also, if you haven't listened to episode 7, why are you listening to this? But we know by the end of episode 7 that Higgins, our faux porter, is dead. But before that happened, Andric takes Higgins out to talk to the engineers. Ross, if looking back, because we're a little bit distanced from when we recorded this episode, what made you decide, or Andric decide, that A, you should go investigate, talk to the engineers, and B, that you should take Higgins with you?
On the first part, on why to go investigate, there was some backstory stuff about Andric and where he's from, that going to explore weird things is part of his family's job. And he has done that kind of thing before. He is perfectly comfortable being in a duo, specifically doing that kind of thing. Why Higgins? Because at that time we didn't know who Higgins was in terms of being an adversary, but we did know that he was a quote unquote porter. And I figured, hey, rather than someone barging into the engine of the train, that it might be helpful to have someone to explain to the engineers that what's going on in the back of the train, while also having an investigator, so to speak.
I think you were all pretty suspicious of Higgins already by this point, though.
There's no downside to keeping Higgins in sight.
Yes, certainly.
Or to keeping him away from Gideon specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you go out, you talked to the engineer who's a goblin and his assistant engineer who's a Goliath. And the assistant engineer went out onto the track to see what they'd seen a shape on the track. Maybe there was a person standing there, maybe not. We don't know. It was the middle of the night. They went to investigate. As you're watching, you still see this thing on the track, but when the assistant engineer gets there, he doesn't see anything. So he comes back. The train starts moving
Yes.
again, and Higgins goes off heading back. I think that you probably he probably had said he needed to check on the passengers, or you probably told him to go ahead, knowing that your compatriots were a couple of cars back. And then you investigated and you found a uniform, a torn, dirty uniform that had been stashed in a coal cart. And you also wound up finding, you were looking at these barrels that were ostensibly full of water. One of the barrels, instead of sounding or feeling like there was water in it, you heard a soft thump on the inside of it when you jostled the barrel.
Correct.
What did you think when you heard that?
Oh, that there was a corpse in there.
And unfortunately, you'd already dismissed Higgins, so you just had to start making your way back to your compatriots.
Well, I wouldn't say unfortunately, because here's the thing. Let's spinning forward and thinking in the moment, like if I open that thing up and spill it out, and let's say someone else walks into that car and I am standing over a corpse, who knows whether I'm pulling it out, shoving it in, what's going on there.
Fair. Well, and especially because then you also found some hastily discarded street clothes in some of the lockers in the break room, and so there's definitely there are definitely things to be suspicious of and things to be wary of in this situation. While you were doing that, Clarice took out her portable hole, in hopes that she could convince Gideon to hide in it. So, and I know that like we talked at the beginning of the campaign about everybody getting a magical item that was either like something that you had from your family or it was a graduation gift or something. I'd love to know how you came across the portable hole and decided that that was what you wanted your magical item to be. And then, from there where the thinking was and in it, because this is the first time we see it in Oops All Bards. So like where did it come from? And also why did you decide that this was the appropriate time to use it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you told us when we were developing our characters was to think about what our graduation gift might be. And for Clarice, she was not attending graduation. She was not interested in graduation. It was not her priority or her parents. This is a tick the box, get the training and get the credential and move on. So I needed to think about what kind of magical object would be in the house, and historically something that her parents would have had or needed, but not feel like they needed in the contemporary, like in this moment, right? So that it could be a situation where Clarice basically gifted herself something from the attic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was looking at what are kind of the unusual or rare or special magical objects that are small enough to be forgotten when you don't need them, and meaningful enough that upon encountering it, without anybody explaining what it is, you'd be able to say, that's doing something interesting and odd. I want that. I want to explore that more. I want to engage with it more. So the idea was to find a magical object that I didn't have to do any kind of incantation to, right? Or where there weren't somatic, like any ingredients needed, nothing to trigger it, right? And where there wasn't a high level of risk of accidentally triggering it, but there also was a way to investigate it and start to understand it without necessarily knowing everything about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my starting point, just like looking for something that could reasonably have been valuable and necessary enough to keep, but not central to daily functioning or worth always having with you. And that was not sort of a monkey's fist kind of level of danger.
Sure.
But still could turn out to be useful depending on circumstance.
And it certainly did.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, but like the idea to use it in this Gideon moment was for Clarice as a character rather than for me as like the person playing her. It's just kind of like a things go in it, right? And they come out of it. So like maybe it's a thing. And obviously like in the train car, like she doesn't know if it needs to be fully flat. Like she just doesn't know if it's gonna work. But the high value thing that is also forgettable is a kind of hard magical object to pin down. So it did take a decent amount of research. And ultimately, the reason I landed on the portable hole was not just all of those components that I laid out, but also thinking about what it is to be from a political family. We move in the shadows, right? We're not interested in, during times of great conflict, being the ones on the front lines. Rather, we're strategizing, we're behind the scenes. And that to me, both in terms of building Clarice as a tiny figure, like physically, but also in terms of thinking about like the modus operandi of her parents and what she will have learned, concealment and like evasion felt very important to just sort of like the family legacy.
Yeah. So you take out your portable hole in this episode for the first time, and you are trying to convince your Uncle Gideon to climb in the hole and then to make it look like he's escaped out a window, which there were some shenanigans when it came to opening the windows. There was a lot of like, are these windows magic? And no, they were just windows. But just as Gideon is getting into the hole, Higgins reappears. And this is where you already, again, we're suspicious of Higgins, but this is where you realize that Higgins truly is a baddie, because Higgins sees that Gideon, for all he knows, is about to get away. He doesn't really know anything about the hole. He just sees that Gideon is in this hole about to get away, and Higgins pulls a knife. And then we're in initiative. And now we're having our first fight since episode 1 or episode 2. How did you all feel getting back into action? And this is also Cretacio's first time fighting with all of you.
All right, I'll go.
Sure.
Yeah, so yeah, it was cool to be in a fight, words. Yeah, it was interesting because I mean he's definitely different from the characters that I've played, just mechanics wise. So definitely turn to turn trying to think of the right thing to do that would make sense in character and also would be effective in turn-based combat was definitely new for me, because there's a lot of things that I would think of also just in terms of some of the limits of the mechanics itself, that if you picture yourself as this particular thing, there's all these things that you'd want to do that you can't necessarily do in a turn-based environment. But it was fun, and I wanted to make sure I injected Cretacio's personality into the fight to make him do things that he would not want to do and then would visibly be frustrated about it, having to be violent and having to use his size to do things. He's not a pacifist like Colonian, but he doesn't like that he has to be a tough warrior dude despite his training montage. But yeah, it was fun. I think it was a cool first look for, I mean, I'd listened to the other episodes a little bit, but it was a cool first look to see how the other characters kind of operated in combat.
Awesome. How did it feel for everybody else to be back in combat? Everybody who was participating in this encounter, at least?
I still find combat as a bard weird when I'm not playing a purely support type of role. It like this is the challenge of Oops All Bards, is trying to figure out what your actual role in combat is.
Yeah, it's definitely not a traditional, you can't go the like sword and board route that you might, or at least like back up the sword and board character that you might in a more traditional game.
Right. As a bard, you're typically trying to debuff the enemies and buff all your allies, but at some point someone has to get in the mix.
For me, the access point was really just like the relationship with Gideon, right? I think
Hmm.
there's ways in which at different moments I take inspiration for Clarice from like different animals, um,
Okay.
just to sort of essentialize her into behaviors because I haven't
Hmm.
played a bard before. And so thinking about animals that are sneaky, like a cat, or thinking about protective, mama bear, but tiny. Like it helps me to um, sort of create the justification, the build out for how she would behave within her skill set. And so
Hmm.
for me, Clarice is never going to be, she's never going to be a bear. She's not interested in being strong or particularly, intimidating. But the idea that in her worldview, um, there are lines you don't cross, and that's specifically about her people, feels very grounded in why she would have studied what she did in school and why she would be interested in politics in general, right? It's
Hmm.
about making a difference long term, protecting people, making lives better. Like she's interested in policy and stuff. And so if you think about why somebody goes into public policy, it is ultimately, no matter where they land, it's always about making a difference, changing the world for the next generation and protecting people, making lives possible and so on. And so she believes in Gideon. She believes he can make a bigger difference for more people. And so even though she certainly doesn't know what it is to cause harm in a meaningful way, she does have that like gut level evaluation that protecting him may serve a greater good and protect
Hmm.
more people. So she can make that um, tough decision to cause
Yeah.
somebody she doesn't know harm because her worldview is always about three steps down the line, the next five plays or six moves in chess or whatever it is.
So I think also one of the things that was happening here in this encounter was that Gideon rolled very poorly throughout this encounter. There was no point at which Gideon really managed to do a lot of damage, despite being the acting Secretary of War, despite being a monk. And Cretaceous was also rolling pretty poorly. Tage, there were several times where you tried to bite and didn't really do anything, or you managed to like
Yeah.
kind of grapple Higgins, but like there was no real damage.
Yeah.
Ultimately, there was damage done, and Cretaceous actually managed to get the first kill of the campaign. Um,
Yeah.
Tage, as the newcomer to the campaign, playing a character who doesn't abhor violence, but who at least wants to find another path for himself. How did it feel for you as a player, but also how did it feel for Cretaceous to get this first kill?
Yeah, I think he, if I remember correctly, I think he is a little bit grumpy about it. But then again, also, I think we were just kind of like, oh no, he's dead. Anyway, uh, but yeah, I think that kind of messed with him a little bit. I think that I think in later interactions he's going to be grumpy about it, having, because he also, I think he scores the final blow with like a big like thunder thigh kick, right, like a Spartan
Yeah,
kick.
not that
um
big. I think he had 3 points left. You rolled 3 points of damage. Like
well,
it
three
was,
was like the maximum for a kick, I
yes.
think, in the mechanics, but yeah, with that being particularly like a not a barbaric in the literal sense of like barbarian class, but that's a big thing for his people, like the giant legs and the claws and the kicking. And so it was by finishing a fight, specifically by doing that one thing that is so stereotypical of his people. Um, yeah, and that's something definitely to talk about with Gideon, who knows him and kind of, I don't think he at this point knows what Cretaceous struggle is, but that's something that he'd want to talk about with him and kind of come to terms with his role in all of this fighting and the war to come. So yeah, I
Got it.
think I think it set up some stuff nicely.
So speaking of people who are hesitant to join the fight, Kelonian took your first damage today. So in this episode, you and Belle, once you evade that mimic in the dining car, you head into the kitchen, and pretty much immediately you find knives being thrown at you, and they hit and they do damage. Another person dressed as a porter who is in the kitchen raiding the kitchen for kitchen knives that can be used as daggers. How did it feel to just have this damage inflicted on you as a character who's a pacifist?
Well, in the world of the game, I'm sure Keylonian would not appreciate being hit with a knife, in the shoulder or wherever we said that it was. But as Bob,
both shoulders.
Yeah, both shoulders. At least it's symmetrical.
I
but
think that
Bob,
would really test him. Really test his pacifism. Be like,
Yes.
Oh, well, that
Yeah.
hurts a little bit.
Right,
That's,
exactly.
I will try to understand where you're coming from.
Right, exactly. He's like, oh, well, I got a couple song ideas out of this, like this experience. Yeah, so I think, but as me playing Keylonian, I like to think that Keylonian would prefer that one of his functions could be to step in the way of danger as a pacifist instead of like having it be inflicted on others. Now, of course, in the real world, like you got to deal with the pain of that. So I don't know how much he would appreciate that. But as me playing him, I could see that as one of his functions is to do that. And, but yeah, it is difficult. It's difficult to do this, like the combat with the pacifism. I thought it would be a nice challenge, and it is a nice challenge. But I do find myself in these combat scenarios being like, well, I could cast sleep. That's fun.
Which is what you did.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's so like I was like, okay, knives are being thrown at you. You get bonus harm because of the sneak attack aspect of it. Roll for initiative, and then you wound up coming up in the initiative first, and you're just like, I cast sleep. Like, and now the initiative's done because your one adversary is asleep. But I did want to also mention when you cast sleep this time, because you had left your guitar in the first class car when you'd headed out with Belle. So you read a haiku instead of singing a song like you normally do when you cast sleep. Where did that idea come from?
Well, it came from the I don't want to say the like player's manual or wherever the description of the turtle is, because there in there somewhere there's a haiku and it's like turtle haiku, and I was like, oh, that's great. I want to do a turtle haiku. So yeah, that's where that came from. And it was because exactly like you said, it left the guitar in the other car, so it had to do something. And haiku is at least fairly easy to throw together.
Yes.
Yeah.
So after he gets knocked unconscious, then Belle ties him up and writes "bad guy" on his forehead in Sharpie. And we decided that yes, there are Sharpies in this world, and there would certainly be Sharpies in the kitchen because the chefs need to label all of their different containers. Ashley, where did the idea to write "bad guy" across his forehead come from? It seemed very, very on point for Belle.
Yeah, I don't, sometimes characters that I play just momentarily possess me and tell me what needs to be done. And in that moment, Belle was like, you can't just leave him like that. What if he gets out, right? And Belle did do a very good job of tying him up, and we established that this is a skill set that Belle has.
That's right.
Because of circus arts.
Yes.
Yes.
Because of circus
arts. Because of circus arts.
Yes.
But it occurred to Belle that this guy's gonna wake up. That's a fact. And there are, I think, I don't remember exactly, but I think like they did try to like take away anything sharp that could be used as a weapon or to escape being bound. But like nothing's guaranteed and wild things are happening. And at the end of the day, this person's still dressed up as a porter, right? So if they get out and they start wandering around pretending that they're good, like who knows if they're gonna go see our friends and pretend that they're an innocent porter, or if they're gonna see some like random passenger and pretend they're an innocent porter. Well, we need to stop that. So how do we do that most effectively? You put a sign on their face.
And that way they can't trick anybody into thinking that they are just part of the staff.
Exactly.
Cool.
And I think there was this flitting moment, and I don't know if this was my thought or Belle's thought, but it was like, if the porter comes out and is like, these people attacked me, that's going to be bad. So yeah, so you just put it on their face, and then the most exciting thing about this choice is that presumably when the porter wakes up, the faux porter wakes up, if they even escape, they're going to be so preoccupied with the whole I just got put to sleep and then tied up situation. They're not going to be looking in a mirror.
I mean, it's incredibly genius, honestly.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, we never established that there are bathrooms on this train and therefore mirrors. I mean, like, you're in the
I
kitchen, there
live
might
in
be some
hope that
shiny
there is a
surfaces.
bathroom on the train.
Yeah, but we never
Yeah,
established that. I don't know, we
how's
still
that
have some more of the
work?
train to explore.
Don't answer that.
Yeah,
If there's a dining car, doesn't there have to be a bathroom?
One would hope.
There's got to be an OSHA, like
Yeah, the equivalent of
equivalent.
OSHA and Udvita.
Yeah.
Um,
I've never considered, in the age of trains, but then I guess before, I don't know, when did plumbing start?
there would at least have been like latrines by the time we got to steam locomotion in
Okay,
our world. Yeah.
right.
porta
But
You know what?
potty on
Not
rails.
worth exploring. Not worth exploring this idea.
I feel like somebody has probably written a doctorate thesis on this. Ashley, one of the things that
Porter
you just
potty.
said, porter potty, got it. Ashley always here with the puns. One of the things that you said, Ashley, is that sometimes your characters kind of take over and like you start to kind of think like them. I'm wondering if that's true for any of the other bards, whether you find that sometimes whether these characters are in other RPGs that you're playing, other campaigns that you're involved in, is there ever a certain point where who you are kind of stops and who your player is kind of picks up? Just Ashley?
Just me. I'm the only one who dissociates. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
I mean, it's a hard thing to articulate. When I am playing D&D, the only time that I really have to differentiate for myself is when I, Anne, get excited about like puzzling something apart and it's not consistent with my character's ability to know things. That's the piece that I struggle with as a person and as an actor. Like, I get very excited. Anne gets very excited when she knows things. It's just like my modus operandi. My brother calls it Anne-splaining. Like, I get very excited when I know things and I want to explain them. It is who I am. Okay, I own it. It is what it is. So my one moment when I have to think about this is either if I know something from a different campaign that to my character is new in this campaign, or I just like have a good guess, like I've logicked out the puzzle. And yet we're not ready to be there as a campaign. So it's a hard question to answer because when I am playing, even if my character is motivated by completely different things, most of the time I'm not separating what I want to do from what the character wants to do because there's a psychology that I've found that I can make sense of, and so I follow it. Right. And I haven't really played characters. I certainly have played characters that are very decidedly not me. Syzygy. But I haven't really played characters that I had to struggle to understand, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's always a sequence that adds up to who they are that makes sense to me. So I just don't know how to answer it.
So just for background for our listeners, Syzygy is a character that Anne plays in a campaign that Ross runs. It's a Spelljammer campaign, although we've yet to actually do the Spelljammer part of the campaign. And Syzygy is an astral elf warlock who is bonkers, and I love them so much. But yes, is very far from who I know Anne to be as an actual person.
And touched on something there that I was actually going to throw out to everybody, which is, and Jill included, which is, we've kind of in a lot of these barbecues discussed, the difference of playing an RPG as a podcast, as opposed to just playing the game itself. But what she just mentioned that I'm curious about is, as performers, what are some choices that you guys have made kind of in the show that you wouldn't have regularly made as a performer because you're playing an RPG on a podcast? Kind of the adverse of the.
It's a great question, Nate.
Well, I do
I
these.
wanna go first.
I interview from time to time.
You
So
you do some interviews from time to time.
Wow, you should like consider doing this as a job.
I've thought about it.
You know, it would be really nice if someone gave Nate a time slot from, say, 5 to 8 p.m. every Monday to, you know, play some of his favorite tunes, talk a bit. That would be wonderful.
It's literally just to listen, another excuse to listen to my own voice is all that is.
Yes, listeners, why not radio? Tune in on Mondays. It's a digital radio channel. You'll get to hear Nate's dulcet tones as well as all of the music that he will play for you. But yes, I think Nate, you're asking a great question, and I don't want to be the first to answer it because I probably have a very different perspective on it as GM versus the players. So, Bards, how do you feel about that? Like the decisions that you make in the pod versus at home games?
So so the question is what would we do differently playing our characters because it's being recorded versus, you know, just playing, or was it like what would we do because it's a podcast versus performing generally, like doing an improv show or something like that?
Doing an improv show or just performing in general, because, you know, you are limited to audio. And now
Right.
you're all audio performers, so like it's not like, you know, you're coming out of left field and not, you know, in your own wheelhouse, but it is a different kind of muscle to flex when you're kind of trying to you know, flesh out a character or flesh out a scene.
I'm going
Yeah.
to jump in here and make a random reference. I think we all probably know about the worst people on the internet who narrate their own actions when they send messages, and they use the asterisks like
Oh yeah,
to indicate like the behavior as they say whatever they're going to say in a
tips
message.
his hat, milady.
Yeah, just like the level
Okay,
of cringe
okay.
inducement
Hold
is
on.
extreme.
Hold on.
I'm that kind.
Now hold on.
No, no,
I mean, I
hold
guess
on,
we
hold
all
on.
do it ironically.
Because no, this is actually, I have a lot of feelings about this, and it is relevant to RPGs, which is that this behavior originated in online role-playing
Yes.
forums when like you couldn't easily distinguish between physicality and speech, and so that became just a shorthand. And that was when I first started in the ye olde days of neopets.com. When I first
Wow.
started role playing, that was the way you did it. And there was nothing cringe about it, except for insofar as being a 12-year-old on Neopets and playing role playing games. Nothing cringe about it beyond all of those factors, except since then, some individuals who perhaps consider themselves activists for the rights of the primary power holding gender have co-opted it and ruined it for the rest of us in the same way that they have ruined what was objectively a very good hat. That is all. Thank you.
Okay, so
I'm
Ashley,
with
Yes,
you.
thank you.
I'm
Thank
with
you.
you.
though. Ashley has anticipated where I was going to go with this, which is that you do have in like the common parlance now a set of additional associations with narrating something that is fundamentally expected to be a visible action, an observable action. And so what I was gonna say
I'm sorry.
is
I
that
have feelings.
well, but this is exactly the point, right? Like we do have feelings. There is an actual legitimate purpose to that narration. And I think I certainly had to adapt back to the origins of that behavior. I had to recognize that if I'm looking at Ashley in person and we're making meaningful eye contact, it's not a valid form of communication on a podcast until I narrate it. Right. And so that for me was an adjustment, just like getting over the other associations and recognizing that there is a skill to narration and benefit to being intentional and thoughtful about naming certain what would be observable behaviors.
It's really funny that you say that, because now that I'm thinking about it, especially like I said, all of you have lived in my head as the editor for quite some time.
You're
I would
welcome.
occasionally hear, yes, I would occasionally hear, and in your voice when you speak in the third person, a hesitation to do so. And now it all makes sense.
I am laughing. No, sorry.
Laughing.
But yeah, it was a thing I had to overcome.
Anybody else, any thoughts on what you do differently for improv if you're on stage or if you're just in a home game versus what you're doing for the pod?
I think for me, I don't know that I would make any different decisions within the game as Andric if I were playing this in a home game versus what we're doing here. I would asterisk checks notes asterisk. I actually probably would have built very differently in that, you know, when the concept of Oops All Bards came about, one of the things that Jill and I talked about were like, oh, this is going to be like a pop off unhinged type of situation. Maybe there needs to be a more grounded, I'll say, quote unquote, straight man type of character. If we were doing this now, knowing what I know now, I probably would have built an even more unhinged character, even as compared to some of the other folks here, and just gone all in, rather than I probably overthought the like, oh, what is the not mechanical balance, but emotional balance of the party. I would have just gone over the deep end. And, you know, who knows? I still might.
Bob, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Yeah. Andric seems like such a normal, well-adjusted person. So.
And very straight.
Yes. Bob.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's not too different for me from, say, doing like an improv sketch or something, because I think that's one of the things I enjoy the most with role playing is being able to, you know, improvise a little bit with the DM and with the other characters. But I guess the biggest difference is the game dynamics. So, you know, in some ways the sky is the limit with when you're in a combat situation, but in other ways you have a list of things that are possible for you to do. And so you know, I guess those sort of become those are kind of your suggestions, you know, for your improv situation, you know, that you're going to work with in some ways. But yeah, mostly I think in interactions, I think it is very similar. You know, I guess there's always the consideration of the like timing, I guess. If it's like, if we're in the middle of something, you might be tempted to like to go off on a dialogue with a character, but like, oh wait, yeah, we have to fight this porter right now. So we got to do that instead of the other thing. So yeah.
I think for me as the GM, one of the things that I do differently that I would not do as much of when running just a home game is the voices for all of the NPCs. That is partly because like I've talked about this with the Mission Rejected folks too, which little plug for Mission Rejected that most of us are involved with in some way. Another podcast. It's our sister pod or our mother pod even on the Porch Room Network. But I do voices, but not really accents. And that I have a couple of accents in my portfolio, but like that kind of limits me in terms of how many voices I actually have before I start to repeat them. And then when we'll have an episode where there will be 5 NPCs, like when we had all of the professors from Mage and Marshall, keeping them straight, not just within an episode, but from episode to episode is exhausting. And I'm positive that there's going to be somebody who, when the season is done, listens to Oops All Bards from episode 1 to episode 12, I think is where we're going to land. And they're going to catch that my accents or my voices are not consistent between episodes for one of our characters. Whereas like when it's a home game, whatever, you just like, you can talk as yourself or come up with an accent, but nobody at the table really is going to hold you accountable to it. I think that also the notion of trying to do that because this is an audio medium, because I don't want everybody to just think like this is just Jill talking for too long. You know, when you're watching a movie and you see like George Clooney looks like George Clooney in everything that George Clooney has ever made. And he generally sounds like George Clooney in everything that he has ever made. But because of the context of the costumes and the other characters and the plot and everything else, we can say like, this is George Clooney in this movie versus this other movie. And it's harder to do that in an audio medium because you don't have all of the other visual cues. So you have to do what you can with your voice. And that gets to be really challenging and sometimes very tedious. Season 2, Oops All Bards, fewer NPCs, I think is where we're going there. So just to move on, because I want to be conscious of our time here. After we get this kill from Higgins and we have the scene in the kitchen car where we have Belle and Kilonian and the now unconscious Porter, Andric and Clarice go to find Belle and Kilonian. And you walk into the dining car and you discover this mimic that you did not know was there because Belle and Kilonian never actually bothered to communicate that back to you. And
Hey,
you
how dare you?
I think
We were
actually,
busy.
I think that you had tried to do it through a spell, but because of the metal of the train, you actually couldn't get the spell through. I think that's what had happened in the last episode or at the beginning of this
Yes,
episode.
I do think that's
Um,
true.
Yes, I'm at least I'm gonna be very generous with that. But so now we have Andric and Clarice who do fight the mimic. Um, which also, that is the first time really that Clarice takes any and does take quite a bit of damage from the mimic. Mimics are a really classic D&D baddie, and we can talk at length about classic D&D baddies and like little pause here above table. We recorded a bonus episode at our last recording where we're going to talk about more of that, so we don't have to get into like the mimics in general, but just to get this question out. So like we've encountered now this kind of classical D&D monster. Edric and Clarice, Ross and Anne, how did you feel about fighting a sentient table?
I loved it. Mimics are one of my favorite monsters in the game, especially when it's not just a treasure chest, but I've used a mimic that was a ceiling that melted down. I have seen mimics that are chairs, that are doors. Like Mimic is so much fun because it plays on the suspicions of players who are suspicious of everything, which I think both Anne and I are. And when you can get us to be like, oh, your suspicions are valid, it really like ups the ante of just really everything is an enemy, and that creates an interesting role play opportunity within the combat.
Yeah, I second everything Ross said. I, as a person, am not suspicious nearly enough, but as a player of D&D and as an English teacher, I refuse to not investigate. I refuse to not read into things. If there are tables, I assume they're there for a reason. Just in terms of the mechanics of storytelling, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I second everything Ross said. It's fun.
And this may,
please.
This may also have something to do with why you have trouble separating your player from yourself when puzzles are put in front of you.
Yeah, it's exactly it. It's that I see everything as an opportunity to gather information. And I guess the only thing I can add is really, I think this is to Nate's question about, or what was it Nate's question? I'm already forgetting what we've already talked about today. To the question of the difference between the character and the self. I, as a person, don't delight in being suspicious of things, but the character, Clarice, that like justifies her whole worldview. Trust nothing, trust no one. Yes, of course the table is going to try to kill you.
I think the table is going to try to kill you is an excellent note to end this episode on. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, audience, for listening to this episode of the Barbecue. Tune in about 2 weeks for the next installment of Oops All Bards, and 2 weeks after that, where we'll talk about that installment of Oops All Bards. As always, I have been your host and game master, Jillian Ashley Blair Ivy. And on behalf of my producer, Nate, and everybody else in the cast, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Oops All Bards is created, GM'd, and directed by Jillian Ashley Blair Ivy. This episode was produced, edited, and sound designed by Nate Runkle. Oops All Bards stars Ashley Banks as Belle Sternamiel, Ann Coleman as Clarice Sauercloud, Ross Curry as Andric Harrowhold, Tage Sinha Das as Cretaceous Thunderthigh, and Bob Killian as Colonian Stumps. The Oops All Bards theme song is by Bob Killian, with additional lyrics by Jillian Ashley Blair Ivy. Oops All Bards is executive produced by The Porch Room. We are part of the Porch Room Network on Spreaker Prime. For more information, visit oopsallbards.com. Thanks, and be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Oops All Bards on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcatcher of choice. And follow us on Instagram and YouTube at Oops All Bards. We'll see you next time.
How will it go?
Well, we're sure you can guess.
Oops, it's all Bards.
Oh, what a mess.
Another quality podcast from the Porch Room.